Boston held its breath the way a city does before something breaks. By 7:15 on a Tuesday in February, the temperature outside had dropped to 4 degrees Fahrenheit, and the Harborview Tower on Atlantic Avenue wore a skin of ice that caught the streetlights and scattered them across the pavement like broken glass. Inside the building's 52nd floor, Evelyn Carter's penthouse sat in the particular silence that expensive things occupy when no one is watching them. She wasn't supposed to be there. Her driver had radioed ahead that a tractor trailer had jackknifed on the expressway. Her assistant, Dana, had rerouted her from a client dinner in the Back Bay. By 8:12, Evelyn stepped off the private elevator into the marble foyer of her own apartment and realized with a small, clinical jolt that she had forgotten about the cleaning crew. The man was on his knees near the kitchen island. He was picking up the remnants of a wine glass that must have fallen from the counter, 3 large curved fragments, and a constellation of smaller ones that caught the recessed light and threw tiny prisms across the marble floor. He held a fragment between his thumb and forefinger, turning it slowly, examining the breakpoint. Not to be careful, that wasn't the gesture. He was studying it. His hand was steady in the way that belongs to surgeons, or to people who have long since burned through their quota of nerves in some other life. Evelyn stood in the doorway without speaking. Her coat was still on. Her briefcase hung from her right hand. She had seen that gesture before. That exact rotation of a fragment between 2 fingers, that specific angle of the wrist. In a conference room 8 years ago, a man had turned a glass paperweight the same way, while 47 people waited for him to speak. He had been deciding whether to dismantle an acquisition or salvage it. He had chosen to dismantle. The decision had cost 400 jobs and recovered $120 million for the fund. The man on her floor looked up, not startled, not apologetic. He simply raised his eyes at the sound of her heels on the marble and looked at her with the flat, unreadable expression of someone who had learned to make himself invisible by choice, not by nature. He was perhaps 38. Dark eyes, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in 2 days. Wearing the gray uniform of Apex Building Services. His hands were clean despite the broken glass. On the floor beside him sat a small orange safety cone and a folded cloth tools placed with the quiet precision of someone who does not fumble. "I'll be finished in 3 minutes," he said. His voice was low, not deferential, just contained. "Who are you?" Evelyn asked. The question came out more direct than she intended, but she didn't soften it. "Michael Hayes, Apex Building Services. I'm one of the Thursday crew. Thursday is tomorrow." Storm pushed the schedule. "Your building manager approved the change." She looked at him for another moment. He looked back at her without expression. Not hostile, but not shrinking either. There was something in the quality of his stillness that unsettled her in a way she couldn't immediately name. Evelyn Carter had spent 12 years learning to read rooms and the people in them. She knew the difference between stillness born of calm and stillness born of discipline. This was the second kind. "Leave the rest," she said. "I'll call the desk. The small fragments will get into the grout. It's better if I finish." She paused. He turned back to the glass, and she watched the back of his neck as he worked methodical, unhurried, and the small thought arrived and would not leave. She had seen this man before. Not his face, his hands. "Fine," she said. "Finish." She walked to the window that ran floor to ceiling on the north wall, and she looked at the city below. And the thought settled lower in her chest like ice water. Behind her, she could hear the quiet sound of glass being placed into a bag. 3 minutes later, the foyer door opened and closed without ceremony, and Evelyn was alone in her penthouse, with the sound of the wind pressing against the glass, and the particular unease of a question she hadn't yet found the words to ask. The alarm on Michael Hayes's phone went off at 4:45 without drama. He had been awake for 10 minutes already. His apartment was on the 3rd floor of a 6-story building in Dorchester, the kind of building where the radiator worked on its own schedule, and the windows required a folded towel at the base to keep the cold from bleeding through the frame. He lay on his back in the dark for a moment, listening to the silence. Outside, snow was falling again. He could tell by the muffled quality of the street sounds the way even the distant bark of a dog came padded and softened through the air. He got up without turning on the overhead light. Sophie's room was across the hall. Door cracked 2 inches. The way she preferred it. She was 9 years old, and slept on her side with both hands tucked under her cheek, and she would not wake for another 2 hours. He stood in the gap of the door for a moment, and listened to her breathe, a habit he had developed in the hospital, and had never fully surrendered. Even 3 years later, when the cardiologists had downgraded her monitoring to twice-annual checkups, and told him the defect was small, manageable, that she would likely live a perfectly ordinary life. Likely. He had spent considerable time in the years since learning to live in the space that word created. In the kitchen, he moved by memory. Coffee, oatmeal, Sophie's medication and the orange pill organizer on the second shelf, metoprolol, low dose, just enough to keep the rhythm steady. He left her bowl covered on the counter with a sticky note that said dragon fruit is in the fridge. I'll be home by 4. He had been leaving her notes like this for 3 years, since her babysitter, a retired teacher named Carolyn, started watching Sophie after school. He ate standing at the counter. Outside, a plow scraped down the street, its yellow light sweeping briefly across the kitchen ceiling. He had been working for Apex Building Services for 14 months. Before that, 18 months at a logistics company doing inventory reconciliation, a job that required a graduate degree to perform adequately and paid as though it didn't. Before that, 3 months of nothing while the legal process completed its slow and expensive work, and he tried to understand what remained of his life. Before that, 6 years at Langford Capital Management, where he had been a senior fixed income analyst, and then a portfolio manager, and then briefly, disastrously, the man whose name appeared in every second paragraph of a Wall Street Journal investigation that ran across 4 editions in October of 2018. He did not read those articles anymore. He had read them enough times in the first months that he could reconstruct them from memory with near-perfect accuracy, including the pull quotes in the headers, including the photograph they had used, a company headshot from 2016, before everything, when his suit had fit and his expression held the specific confidence of a man who believed that his intelligence constituted a kind of protection. He rinsed his bowl. He packed his work bag. He stood for a moment in Sophie's doorway, and she breathed steadily in the dark, and he turned and left for the bus stop at 5:11, walking through the snow with his collar up and his hands in his pockets, and if he felt the cold as an injustice, he did not show it to anyone. There was no one to show it to. That was, in its own way, a mercy. The 43rd floor of the Carter Holdings Tower in the financial district was a different kind of cold. It was the cold of controlled air and stainless surfaces, of floor-to-ceiling glass walls that looked out over a gray sky and a gray harbor, and a city that moved 16 stories below, with the indifference of something that had stopped waiting for permission. Evelyn Carter sat at the head of a conference table and looked at the acquisition summary laid out before her, and felt, for the first time in 2 years, the specific sensation of not being sure. Her father, Robert Carter, had built Carter Holdings from a regional property fund into a diversified investment management firm over the course of 30 years. He had died of a coronary embolism in his office on a Monday morning 18 months ago, at 61, before he had adequately prepared his succession plan. Evelyn had taken the chair not because the board had unanimously chosen her, but because no one had found a more credible alternative before the auditors arrived, and she had performed well enough under pressure that the uncertainty had gradually calcified into consensus. She was good at this. She was better than good. She was thorough in the way that people become who have spent years being underestimated, which meant she checked things twice and once more. And she did not celebrate early. The acquisition on the table was a portfolio of 11 mixed-use properties across Boston, Providence, and Hartford, held by a consortium called Hartwell Development Group. The valuation was $412 million. The numbers in the prospectus were clean. She had reviewed them herself. And her CFO, Dennis Howell, had reviewed them again. The board was asking her to move within 60 days. It was, Dennis had said in the pre-meeting, a clean deal. Evelyn said nothing to that. She had learned long ago that the language of cleanliness, clean deal, clean books, No complications was the precise vocabulary of a document that hadn't been looked at hard enough. She turned to page 41 of the prospectus, where the Boston waterfront properties were itemized. And she looked at the comparable sales figures in the appendix and felt the small, cold tickle of something not quite right.